Imagine you're a diplomat, traveling through a conflict zone, shielded by the sanctity of international law, a mere passenger in a marked vehicle, committed to protecting peace. Now imagine suddenly your convoy is caught in a hail of gunfire. The shooters, the very state you're negotiating with. The reason? Still shrouded in dispute. This isn't fiction. This is what happened in Jenin, and the shockwaves are still rippling across the globe. The Jenin incident isn't just another tragic headline from the Middle East. It's a potential turning point for the entire system of global diplomacy and how countries confront crises, resolve conflict, and protect those who risk their lives to hold nations together. Today, we'll unravel how a single, high-stakes standoff could redefine the rules of international engagement and what it reveals about the deep-rooted problems facing Israel, Palestine, and the world's response. How did we get here? To understand why Jenin became the flashpoint it did, you have to grasp decades of unresolved tension, occupation, and distrust. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, stretching back to the mid-20th century, is layered with history. Wars, failed peace processes, shifting borders, and cycles of violence. It is a conflict marked not only by physical barriers, but by ruptures in international law and diplomatic norms. Jenin lies in the northern West Bank, a region long associated with resistance, military operations, and frequent flare-ups. For years, Jenin has symbolized both the Palestinian struggle and the Israeli security dilemma. Occupied by Israel since 1967, Jenin's refugee camp has endured repeated incursions, clampdowns, and humanitarian crises. But diplomatic missions have, until now, largely been treated as untouchable, protected by a global understanding that some lines simply must not be crossed. Enter Operation Iron Wall. Since January 21, 2025, Israel intensified military activity in Jenin, cutting off outside access and locking down the area. UN reports described a virtual siege, with humanitarian workers and even high-level delegations unable to reach those inside. The stated goal: neutralize militant threats. The effect? Heightened isolation and mounting international concern. Against this backdrop, a marked diplomatic convoy attempted to enter Jenin. On board, representatives from Canada, Finland, and international organizations, traveling within agreed protocols. What happened next shattered assumptions. Israeli forces opened fire on the convoy, despite its diplomatic status and visible markings. Though no fatalities occurred, the message sent was unmistakable. Even those shielded by international law are at risk. World capitals were stunned. The German Foreign Ministry labeled the shooting unprovoked and demanded a full investigation, a rare rebuke from an ally that usually treads carefully. Canada confirmed that 4 of its personnel were in the delegation, responding by summoning the Israeli ambassador. Finland, too, was unequivocal. Foreign Minister Elina Valtonen declared, "Any deviation from any route is not an excuse. Opening fire on civilians, especially those protected by diplomatic immunity, is unjustifiable." The Palestinian Authority called it a deliberate and unlawful act. The delegation, they alleged, was targeted intentionally, a claim that raises haunting questions about respect for diplomatic immunity. For context, the backbone of diplomatic protection is the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, adopted in 1961. It obligates states to shield diplomats from coercion and harm, ensuring the machinery of global relations never grinds to a halt, even during war. Breaching this norm could be compared to setting fire to a lifeboat during a shipwreck. When this convention crumbles, trust evaporates, and chaos becomes the rule. How did Israel justify the firing? The Israeli Defense Forces quickly stated that the convoy had strayed from the approved route and entered an unauthorized area near active operations. Multiple eyewitnesses, however, disputed this version, highlighting that the convoy was clearly marked and operating transparently. Roland Friedrich, director of UNRWA Affairs, minced no words. This incident is a stark reminder of the lax use of excessive force routinely deployed by Israeli security forces. International organizations were not alone in their outrage. The Arab League issued a unified call for global protection of Palestinian civilians, denouncing repeated Israeli violations of international law. Pressure mounted as the International Court of Justice began examining the legal consequences of Israel's actions in the territories, signaling the possibility of broader legal accountability. To grasp the magnitude of this moment, consider what's at stake. Diplomatic immunity isn't a privilege, it's a compact between nations, built on centuries of bloody lessons. If one delegation can be shot at in Jenin, who is next? Aid workers, journalists, business envoys? As Stefan Dujarric, the UN spokesperson, put it is clear that diplomats who are doing their work should never be shot at, attacked in any way, shape, or form. But there's a deeper, more troubling question. Is this incident an isolated lapse or a symptom of a much bigger problem, an erosion of international norms and a growing culture of impunity in conflict zones? Hanan Ashrawi, a respected Palestinian scholar and activist, says, the incident reflects a pattern of impunity and disregard for international norms by the Israeli occupation forces. Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Middle East Project, adds, this is another example of how the international community's failure to hold Israel accountable emboldens further violations. These are not just dramatic words. Over the past decade, observers have logged a consistent pattern. Incidents where the distinction between combatant and civilian, or between local and international actors, is blurring. Each time a norm is ignored, it's harder to re-establish the boundary. Let's talk about accountability. Germany's unusually sharp condemnation, Canada's immediate demand for answers, and France's summoning of the Israeli ambassador all reflect growing impatience among Western allies. Jean-Noël Barrot, French foreign minister, called the incident unacceptable, underscoring that routine explanations will no longer suffice. Yet, the mechanisms for accountability are murky, and the stakes are high. Israel has traditionally argued for the right to defend itself in an environment rife with asymmetric threats. The IDF claims operational security is paramount, and that mistakes are inevitable when dealing with shifting front lines and ever-present dangers. But as the world saw in Jenin, when the line between defense and excess is crossed, allies begin to question their partnerships. Sanctions, trade relations, and even diplomatic recognition can be on the table when the international community feels its red lines have been violated. What's more, this incident comes at a time when international law is already under strain around the world. From Ukraine to Sudan, the perception that might makes right is gaining traction. If diplomatic immunity becomes negotiable, then the decades-old infrastructure of global engagement could collapse. The rules-based international order is at a crossroads, says Kaja Kallas, the EU High Representative, who warns that any threats on diplomats' lives are unacceptable, and we call on Israel to investigate this incident. The question isn't just about Jenin, it's about whether there will be consequences for violating the core rules that underpin global stability. Here's the most unsettling part. Investigations in cases like this are often opaque, protracted, and unsatisfying to those seeking justice. Israel's official explanation, that the convoy deviated from its route, stands on shaky ground as more evidence and testimony emerge. Meanwhile, the world watches to see whether the incident is whitewashed, quietly buried, or triggers real repercussions. So where does this leave us? On the one hand, there's renewed momentum among international bodies to demand transparency and accountability. The International Court of Justice could, in theory, press for legal findings against both individuals and states. Countries, too, may consider targeted measures, sanctions, diplomatic freezes, or closer scrutiny of military sales. On the other hand, entrenched alliances, economic ties, and security interests often dilute the impact of outrage. As Roland Friedrich of UNRWA notes, it's not about one convoy or one mistake, it's about the entire system of how force is used and abused when the world is watching, and especially when it isn't. Emotions are running high, not just in diplomatic circles, but among ordinary people who see in this incident a metaphor for the broader collapse of trust in systems that are supposed to protect the vulnerable. The sense of injustice is palpable. International law feels more fragile, less certain. And yet, despite the storm of condemnation, there are powerful actors eager to move past the crisis, fearing escalation, or simply prioritizing strategic interests. Will this be another incident lost in the endless news cycle, or the catalyst for real change? The world is now confronted with a critical question. Will the Jenin incident finally force a reckoning with unchecked power and fading diplomatic protections, or is it doomed to become another forgotten outrage? In the next part, we'll examine the possible futures awaiting the region and the world if the rules of the diplomatic game are rewritten under fire. As we step beyond the waves of outrage and official statements, it's time to look forward. The Jenin incident is not just another headline. It's a litmus test for the future of international law, how governments, institutions, and even ordinary people will react to the breakdown of the very rules that are meant to protect us all. So what happens next? What are the possible consequences? And could this be the tipping point for meaningful change, or will it join the long list of unresolved crises in the world's most intractable conflict? First, let's consider the most immediate risk, the normalization of such incidents. When a diplomatic convoy is fired upon by military forces, regardless of what side of a conflict you stand on, it's a shakeup of the foundation upon which diplomacy rests. If this act goes unpunished or unaddressed, it sets a dangerous precedent. Other governments, in other flashpoints, might feel more emboldened to ignore diplomatic protections. Imagine a world where envoys aren't safe, where embassies become targets or pawns. Expert voices reinforce these fears. UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric was unequivocal. It is clear that diplomats who are doing their work should never be shot at, attacked in any way, shape, or form. This principle isn't just tradition or etiquette, it's a safeguard for dialogue. Without it, conflict gets sharper, more dangerous, and less predictable. But is there potential for a different path? For change, real, systemic change, to bloom from this crisis, it hinges on whether the international response is unified and resolute. Here, the immediate reactions offer a glimmer of intrigue. For the first time in years, Germany, Finland, France, Canada, and a host of EU voices have issued unusually strong condemnations. Canada even summoned Israel's ambassador after confirming that its own personnel were among those targeted. Finland's foreign minister drew a hard line. Any deviation from any route is not an excuse. This convergence may signal a willingness by powerful states to cross a line they've avoided for years, holding Israel accountable in ways that have real teeth. What might that look like? Multiple future scenarios are now in play. The most talked about is the imposition of targeted sanctions. These could take the form of asset freezes or travel bans on individual commanders or military units involved. We've seen similar measures after violations in other conflict zones, and their potential deployment in response to the Jenin incident would mark a sea change. Notably, such sanctions would not simply be symbolic. They would directly inhibit the freedom and finances of those deemed responsible, creating a strong deterrent for future misconduct. Then there's the push for increased monitoring and transparency. Calls are growing, not just from human rights groups but from established powers, for an independent, perhaps even permanent monitoring mechanism in the West Bank. This would mean boots on the ground, international observers documenting violations in real time, a direct challenge to the fog of war tactics that often shield perpetrators from accountability. A more radical possibility? The reevaluation of bilateral relations. If major EU states were to slow down or suspend military cooperation or reconsider trade agreements, the consequences for Israel's diplomatic and economic standing could be profound. While such moves would face fierce opposition from some quarters, the growing consensus around the sanctity of diplomatic law could make these steps more likely than ever before. But there are also risks. Backlash from supporters of Israel, both within and outside the region, could harden attitudes and further polarize international forums. The danger here is a deepening isolation and an entrenchment of hardline policies, not just in Israel, but among its allies, who may see pressure as unfair or politically motivated. In parallel, there's the legal track. The International Court of Justice, already engaged in examining Israel's policies in the occupied Palestinian territories, will almost certainly consider the Jenin incident within its broader investigation. While ICJ rulings lack direct enforcement power, they carry enormous symbolic weight and can shape the diplomatic and legal climate for years to come. If the ICJ finds that diplomatic immunity was willfully violated, it could prompt further action in the UN Security Council, though so far, history suggests a veto may block any direct punitive measures. Against these possible international responses, the question remains, will any of this filter down to the ground level? Will it make a real difference for people living in conflict zones? Or will it amount to another round of statements and reports gathering dust on the shelves of international bodies? The true answer may depend on you, the global public. Public pressure, media attention, and citizen activism have repeatedly proven to be powerful forces in driving legal and diplomatic change, even where governments hesitate. The outrage over the Jenin incident has already sparked protests and grassroots campaigns across continents. Social media has fueled a wave of solidarity, not just for diplomats, but for the besieged residents of Jenin camp who remain isolated by military operations, cut off from humanitarian assistance. And this brings us to a crucial point, the practical lessons that go far beyond geopolitics. What does the Jenin incident mean for the world and for you? First, it's a vivid reminder that the so-called rules-based order is only as strong as the willingness of states and societies to uphold it. Diplomatic immunity, international humanitarian law, and the safety of non-combatants are not abstract concepts. They are lines drawn in the sand, lines that, if crossed without consequence, make the world a less safe place for everyone. For viewers in democratic countries, there's a direct call to action. Public opinion shapes foreign policy. It drives lawmakers to demand investigations, sanctions, and reform. When citizens make it clear that violations of international law are unacceptable, governments are forced to respond. The fact that so many nations, including key Israeli allies, have taken a hard stance in this case was not inevitable. It was spurred by people refusing to let the story fade away. But there's a deeper lesson here about the fragility of the international system. As Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Middle East Project, has observed, this is another example of how the international community's failure to hold Israel accountable emboldens further violations. If law is to mean anything, it must be enforced impartially. The selective application of justice, wherever it occurs, not only undermines the principle itself, but also breeds cynicism and double standards. For students of international relations, journalists, and engaged citizens, the Jenin case is a wake-up call. The details matter. The stories of the Canadian, Finnish, and UNRWA personnel who found themselves under fire are not just statistics. Each violation of diplomatic immunity chips away at the shield that allows international actors to de-escalate crises and provide aid where it's needed most. From a humanitarian point of view, the restriction of access to Jenin camp since January 21, 2025, as reported by the UN, adds a distressing layer to the story. Humanitarian agencies have sounded the alarm. Lives are at risk not only from direct violence, but from the slow suffocation of aid, food, and medical assistance. Why does this matter for you, thousands of miles away? Because the breakdown of international norms anywhere can ripple everywhere. When the lines are blurred in Jenin, it sends a signal to every conflict zone, from Ukraine to Sudan to Myanmar, that there may be little penalty for crossing them. So what can you do? First, stay informed and share verified information. In an age of disinformation, clarity is a form of resistance. Second, add your voice. Write to your representatives. Support independent journalism and organizations that document and challenge abuse. Third, don't underestimate the power of outrage when it is targeted and persistent. History shows us that the loudest voices, when joined together, can become impossible for even the most intransigent leaders to ignore. As Kaja Kallas, EU High Representative, insisted, any threats on diplomats' lives are unacceptable, and we call on Israel to investigate this incident. Insist is the key word. These calls must be sustained, repeated, and made concrete through action. In the end, will this incident bring real consequences and systemic change? The answer for now is mixed. The diplomatic machinery has been set in motion. Investigations are underway. The ICJ's proceedings could set an important precedent. Countries are being forced to clarify where they stand, on law, on accountability, and on the protections that make dialogue possible. But history warns us, without sustained engagement, even the gravest of incidents can fade into the background noise of daily news. The risk is not that the world will forget, but that leaders will calculate that they can move on without paying a price. The secret fact, one rarely discussed in the mainstream coverage, is this. What happens now will shape not just the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the very fabric of international diplomacy. The Vienna Convention, the keystone of diplomatic immunity, is only as strong as the collective will to enforce it. This crisis is a crossroads. So, as you finish watching this video, ask yourself, what side of history will you help write? The Jenin incident is a chapter still unfolding. It can be a warning or a turning point. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Like, share, and comment. Let your networks, your representatives, your governments know that the world is watching and that you care. And if you want to see more deep